Then we're going to get into the chapter on monopolistic competition. That'll be this class and next class. We'll end the next class with oligopoly. There's no cost curves or anything for oligopoly. So it's a very simple chapter, which will be good. And that'll leave us the last two classes to talk about other stuff. Anyone in here interested or care about Bitcoin, how it works or anything about that? Okay, so I'll do a quick discussion about how Bitcoin works. I took a class on the theory of money in grad school, and that was one of the things we covered for a couple of weeks. Right when it spiked in price the first time, so it was like a really cool time to do that. Then we'll talk about some other weird topics. One of the things I hit pretty hard early on in class is that people are rational. The economic definition of rational is acting when the benefit is greater than the cost. Well, people do a lot of weird things. So some people say that this is evidence that the assumption of rationality doesn't really hold in the real world. Well, a lot of these weird practices that people engage in, and I mean things like medieval ordeals, where you determine if someone was guilty or innocent by having them plunge their hand in boiling water. They pulled it out and they weren't harmed. They were innocent because God protected them. If they pulled it out and it was damaged and they were like all scarred up and stuff, then they were guilty because God didn't protect them. Seems crazy, but practices like that were actually really creative ways that societies leverage superstition and common beliefs in order to provide some sort of common good or governance that they're not able to do otherwise. So we'll go through some interesting and entertaining examples about like ordeals, gypsy law, which is really weird, and probably European witch trials, maybe one or two other things. Just some fun stuff to actually apply some of the basic ideas of economics that we learned very early on, but in a much more interesting setting than some curves like that for a monopolist. All right. So with that, my time to bitch about monopoly policy. So we talked about how monopolies reduce consumer surplus and economic efficiency. Makes markets less efficient and people worse off than if we had, really good, robust competition. So government enacts some policies to try to prevent monopolies from forming, or if they do form, to help consumers out, help improve efficiency. Let's get to this slide for the antitrust laws. The first Antitrust Act was passed nationally in 1890. It was called the Sherman Antitrust Act. Prohibited these large firms from operating. It was followed up by the Clayton Act in 1914, which is just basically built upon Sherman. Both of these acts were left intentionally vague for two reasons. One, Congress wanted the leeway to be able to go after different firms in different situations. They didn't want to, tie their hands to specific, rules. The other, Sherman was passed in 1890. Economists didn't know that much about monopolies. This is still pretty early on in the profession. But there were a lot of political motives behind the passage of these antitrust acts, like Sherman and Clayton. So the Sherman Antitrust Act was based on a law from the state of Missouri, passed like the previous year. Basically what was happening in Missouri is they had a lot of small farms. But in the late 1800s, after the Civil War, we saw transportation costs begin to fall substantially. So we had competition from outside the area going on. So you had a bunch of small farms in Missouri selling their crops to local towns. They now had competition from bigger farms outside of the area. Because these were bigger, they were more efficient, and now with lower transportation costs, they can sell their products in Missouri at a lower price than they were before. And it's even at a lower price than a lot of these small farms can handle. So there's a lot of pressure on them. They're getting put out of business. So they started lobbying the state legislature for some sort of antitrust act to prevent those other farms from outside the area from selling their products at such low prices. So they were trying to restrict competition from outside the area. Now, when we talked about monopolies, we compared a monopolist here to a market in perfect competition. In perfect competition, the price is right here at PC, and the quantity being produced in equilibrium is there at QC. For a monopoly, because they produce where marginal revenue is marginal cost, so right here, they're producing less, there's less output, and it's being sold at a higher price. That's why monopolies are bad. There's less being produced, and it's being sold at a higher price than if there was competition going on. But that's not the problem that was going on in Missouri at the time. They passed an antitrust act because outside firms were selling at a lower price, and it was increasing the quantity being bought and sold on the market. So this was pure protectionism for local small farms. And we see this happen again with Sherman and Clayton when they were both passed nationally. Looking back at the trusts of the 1870s and 1880s, some economists, or I guess economic historians, have studied this empirically, and they found that prices were falling through this period, despite the fact that there were these large companies eating up their competitors. So like Standard Oil, they were one of the big bad guys, you know, gobbling up every other like energy company out there. But prices were falling substantially during this whole period of time. And the output they were producing was growing. So this is the opposite of what we'd say from monopoly. There's actually good stuff going on. Consumers are being made better off. This was just firms discovering economies of scale for the first time because we've broken down a lot of the high cost of transportation. Remember, in the 1800s, there was no interstate highway system. I mean, even paved roads between like large cities didn't exist very often. We didn't have automobiles yet. In the American South during the Civil War, there were 5 different gauges of railroad tracks, like 5 different sizes. The transportation was very difficult. I guess Southerners can thank Sherman for that because he just destroyed the entire South. If there's any Southerners here, I'm sorry for bringing that up. There'll be joking the Beverly Hillbillies that like Granny hated, like anytime someone brought up the Civil War, she'd like get all upset because they lost. Another thing I want to note is often monopolists that are, you know, they go after these firms under the Sherman Act or the Clayton Act. They're accused of engaging in what's called predatory pricing. So they charge at an extra low price in order to put out their competitors. Once all their competitors go bankrupt, then they go and charge a higher price again and act like a monopolist. According to Gary Becker, Nobel laureate in economics, he said this has never been the case in the United States. We've never actually seen this happen, even though it's been accused of occurring quite a bit. The thing about predatory pricing, which makes it so difficult, is that in order to engage in it successfully as a hopeful monopolist, you have to make sure all your competitors know you're doing it and know that you're committed to doing it for a long time. So you're gonna lose money. You tell them, I'm gonna lose money for a long time, and you're just gonna have to deal with it. You're gonna have to go out of business. I'm gonna force you out of business by charging these low prices that I can't even maintain in the long term. Well, if a firm's suffering losses and they're big enough to be able to do this, odds are they're publicly traded. So you can make yourself a lot of money just by going and shorting them. Because again, this isn't like a secret. They have to let their competitors know they're doing this. And even if you're successful and you're able to force out your competition and you become that monopolist through predatory pricing, theoretically, if it worked, it's still not going to last for long if there's no barriers to entry in your industry. If you're in an industry where that's a natural monopoly, well, odds are you'd already be a monopoly. But at that point, because of barriers to entry, no one would be able to get in. But if you were in a perfectly competitive market or a monopolistically competitive market and you forced out competitors, the physical and human capital that your competitors had don't cease to exist. If St. Francis closes, we still have all the stuff in here to make the classrooms run. All the professors still have PhDs, besides me. So an entrepreneur can buy these assets and begin competing immediately. Once a firm that's a successful monopolist starts charging higher prices, the entrepreneur can step in, start charging low market prices. So it won't last long. An example of this is Washington Post in the 1930s. You guys heard of the Washington Post? They went bankrupt, went out of business, completely shut down in the 1930s. Entrepreneur came in, bought them immediately, hired back like most of the reporters, if not all of them, and started selling papers like immediately. Actually got yelled at during a job interview for suggesting that for the auto industry in the 2009 crisis, when they need to be bailed out. So in practice, I don't have that here. Okay, who actually brings these monopoly lawsuits under Sherman and Clayton? There's two main groups, because for every one brought by the government, there's 20 brought by other firms. So it's not primarily not the government going after monopolists, it's other firms going against someone they accuse of being a monopolist. The first is vertical partners. So if I'm a firm, either the supplier that I buy materials to make the products from, or the firm that I sell my products to actually sell to consumers. If I as a firm break a contract with them, they will go after me obviously for breach of contract. But also if I'm large enough, they'll go after me under Sherman or Clayton. The reason being that damages are tripled under that legislation because they're monopolists. So instead of just getting back the value that I wronged them or I took from them, they're getting triple that under one of these suits. So of course, if they have the opportunity, they're gonna be encouraged to do that. If I had the chance to sue someone and get triple, I would do that. I don't think that's like an irrational thing to do. The second group is competitors. So according to Thomas Sowell, another economist who, I don't know, this isn't like some random crank, this is like a real well-known, respected economist. Most cases of antitrust is when the monopolist was charging lower prices than their competitors. So most of these cases, you don't have the inefficiency that monopolies are producing. You have lower prices from more efficient firms that are operating with economies of scale. So for example, there was this old grocery store called A&P. They don't exist anymore, but back in the 40s and 50s, they were the largest grocery store chain in the country. They had 1/5 of all grocery store sales, which was enormous. They were in all these different markets across the US. They were selling, because of their size, they were able to get lower prices from their suppliers. They were selling at a lower price. So they were being more efficient than their competitors, but their competitors went after because they were destroying the market competition because they were so big. I mentioned Alcoa earlier in the monopoly chapter. That aluminum company was basically a monopoly because they were like the only one with access to bauxite or whatever material makes aluminum. The whole time they were a monopolist, the prices of aluminum fell and the quantity that they were producing was increasing. So again, not behaving like a monopolist. And we see this time and time again. Yeah, I'll skip the Herfindahl Index stuff. So that's basically a lot of the problems we see with how antitrust policy actually plays out. In theory, this is a really good idea. Again, we have all this lost efficiency from monopolies when there's no market competition. But unfortunately, in practice, it tends to be used by firms going after their rivals or politicians going after unpopular companies that people tend to not like to help them, get reelected, get donations, all that stuff. It's important to remember when you hear the government or you hear people calling for the government to go after firms that they call monopolists that are too big, if they're charging lower prices, if there's they're increasing productions, there's a lot of the product being bought and sold, they're not really being monopolists or they're not behaving like a monopolist. So this is, in essence, a good situation. Not to saying that those companies are actually good or moral or it's great that they're like that, but we're not seeing the problems associated with monopolists. You may get one question about that on the final, but a real general kind of thing. I'm not going to ask you specifics and stuff. You guys have any questions about that before we jump into monopolistic competition? it's always important to highlight some of the shortcomings. Even we think like there's really good intentions for something, if there are shortcomings in practice, it's something we need to recognize so we can figure out ways around it to make it more efficient, make it better. I don't know, this is an introductory class, so it's not, we don't really have the time to get into like specifics of how to fix these sorts of problems. Like we could do probably like half a semester on like antitrust policy as it is and how we could improve it and what the problems are, things like that. I don't want to stand up here and bitch just for bitching's sake, but it's ever show you, even when there is really good intentions behind something, oftentimes it's not used appropriately or used perfectly, and there's ways we can make it better. So at least if you highlight the problems, that gives us an avenue to look for like, okay, what's the way we can make this better? Okay, so now we're getting into monopolistic competition. So this is the kind of market that we typically see for goods and services. So you can look around you and see this as, real world examples. Perfect competition and monopoly are a lot harder to actually see in the real world. They're a lot less common. They're kind of extremes. This is monopolistic competition, more in the middle, something that you see quite frequently and has some of the same characteristics of perfect competition and some of the same characteristics as monopoly. So in perfect competition, remember we had many firms. Those firms sell identical products, and there's no barriers to entry. So there's robust competition. Those first two features, the many firms and the identical products, are why we had that horizontal demand curve for individual firms. Because of that, if you tried to raise your price, consumers would just go to another firm because they can get that exact same good from someone else. You had no ability to set prices as a firm. Anytime you tried to raise a price, you lose all your customers. Anytime you lower it, you're not going to be able to sell more. Or even if you were able to sell more, you'd be able to sell that many if you chose to sell at the market price. So there's no reason to lower prices either. You're basically stuck at that one market price. In monopolistic competition, this isn't the case. So we end up with a downward sloping demand curve just like we saw in monopoly. So monopolistic competition has characteristics 1 and 3. So there's a lot of firms, and there's no barriers to entry, or very low barriers to entry. So again, we have really good competition. But firms don't sell identical products. And in the real world, we know that firms don't sell identical products. There's going to be some differences in the characteristics between these goods. So monopolistic competitive firms are going to end up with zero long-run profit, just like perfect competition. Because anytime there's economic profit being earned, because of the lack of barriers to entry, other firms can jump in and begin competing. My favorite example, White Claw, they start selling hard seltzers. They make a lot of money doing it. They earn great profits. All these other alcohol companies start selling their own hard seltzers. There's no barriers to entry. It is monopolistic competition. There are differences between the different hard seltzers. Four Locos are like super sugary. Bud Light seltzers are like not sugary at all. I don't know, some have like stronger flavor, some have like weaker flavor, so it's more just like the seltzer water you're getting. All these different characteristics. So there is some differentiation. If they raise their price, White Claw raises their price, not everyone is going to jump to one of their competitors because White Claw still offers you something that other firms can't, or their products can't. So we're not going to have a horizontal demand curve. We're going to have like that monopolist downward sloping demand curve. But we're still going to have zero long-run profit. And just a note about competition, at one point A&P even got up to 40% of the national market share of grocery sales. Even when they did, in local markets, there were still several smaller competing grocery stores. So you'd have like the big dog A&P, and then you'd have like maybe 2 or 3 mom and pop shops. In some places, there even weren't competitors. Maybe there was one competitor, maybe there weren't any. But we can still consider this a competitive market. And keep this in mind as we're walking through monopolistic competition. Is that because there were no or very low barriers to entry, even if there wasn't a firm competing against them, there was no other grocery store in this town, it was easy for one to pop up and begin competing against them. So they had to behave as if they were facing competitors. Because if they didn't, if they tried to act like monopolists and charge high prices above the competitive market equilibrium, you would see, I don't know, Wegmans, I mean, this is obviously different time frames. You would see another grocery store come in and open up place there, knowing that they could charge lower prices and still earn a profit. Because of that, AMP had to worry about that, and they had to behave as if there was competition going on to prevent them from coming in, taking all their business. Now, we talked about perfect competition. Competition was only based on price. Because the goods were exactly the same, there was nothing they did to try to stand out. They didn't try to create new goods. They didn't try to, vary their characteristics, try to appeal to different market segments. All very important things if you're a business. Obviously, you can innovate your production methods and stuff and try to lower your costs so you could charge a lower price. But there's a lot of other things you can do, other ways to innovate to make your firm better. So you can come up with a new product design. You can make have the actual product be somehow different than it previously was to stand out from your competitors. You can increase the quality or the performance. You can make it last a lot longer. Again, you can use some sort of cost-cutting technology. We're not saying that that's not something you can do, but you can do all these other things that makes your goods actually different. You can just change your packaging, make it look more attractive, give consumers a better description of what you're actually selling them, so when they look at it, they know exactly what they're getting. Reduce that kind of missing information that they have, so they actually know or have a better idea of what that product's going to be. You can give them some sort of assurance of quality, so warranty or money-back guarantee. One of the things in Tommy Boy where the guy at the one shop wanted the guarantee on the box for the brake pads. And that's one way that Callahan's competitors stood out, was by offering a warranty or money-back guarantee, something that they didn't do. And you can develop a brand name. So there's brand name capital where you see that company's name, or you see, the name of that actual product, and it conjures up images of certain characteristics. Maybe you think, oh, this is a super high quality brand, or this is a luxury brand, something like that. And firms could even engage in loyalty programs. So you have your Sheetz card. Every time you get gas, you get a little bit of money off. Every time you spend money at Sheetz, you use your Sheetz card, and then you get money off on gas later. So a lot of different ways to try to develop some sort of market share. Do something that sets your product apart from other companies' products. So that's what we see in monopolistic competition. So in this market, barriers to entry are still low. There's a lot of firms that are competing, but the products they're selling are not the same. They're often very similar, but they're not exactly the same. There's some differences between them, some characteristics that some consumers like and some consumers don't like. And that's the key difference, and that's the key characteristic about monopolistically competitive markets, the differentiation in these goods. So the example that your textbook uses throughout this chapter is Chipotle. So they sell burritos, they compete in the burrito market, they call it. So they're competing against other firms that are selling burritos. But these burritos are not exactly like the competitors. There's a difference in quality and in ingredients between Chipotle and Taco Bell. Chipotle offers you more customization. You can go to California Tortilla. I think they're really high quality, but you don't get the customization choices that Chipotle offers you. There are a lot of different firms in the fast casual, like Chipotle. That's what they call their type of restaurant. A lot of the competitors selling the same. There's very similar types of food there. And you have Taco Bell that sells a little bit lower. They're just more straight up fast food. Maybe there's some more sit-down Mexican places that also sell really high quality burritos, but offering you a slightly different dining experience. Each of these offers a slightly different product to appeal to different segments of the market. And this is why we're going to see this downward sloping demand curve. Because even though other firms sell burritos, some people prefer Chipotle over the others. So if Chipotle raises their price, in this case they raise it from $7 to $7.50. The quantity that they're going to sell decreases, in this example, from 3,000 burritos a week to 2,400 burritos a week. So we move up along the demand curve with that change in price. In a perfectly competitive market, everyone would go to one of their competitors. But Chipotle offers you some things that you can't get elsewhere. It's as if they have a mini monopoly on Chipotle burritos because of this slight difference. For some people, these small differences aren't going to be enough for them to buy these burritos at a higher price. So they'll go to a competitor. But for a lot of people, they're still gonna stick with Chipotle because no one else offers quite what they offer. But because of this, Chipotle faces a downward sloping demand curve. So the market demand curve, if this is just the market for burritos, not even all the stuff they offer, but just the burritos, market demand curve is gonna be downward sloping, just like perfect competition. But the firms, each of the firms' demand curves will also be downward sloping. And the implications of this is that if Chipotle wants to sell a greater number of burritos, they lower the price. If they want to earn a higher profit per burrito, they increase the price. Or get more money per burrito, they increase the price. Before, in perfectly competitive markets, firms had no choice where they wanted to price. Now firms have a choice. And if you're out in the real world working for a company, odds are they're going to have a choice up to, it's up to them to determine what price they want to sell the good at. We'll walk through, again, these like tables with the costs and the revenues, just to show what the demand curve is going to look like and what the profit situation is going to look like. But it's going to be very similar to the monopolist. So it's not like we're learning brand new stuff. Hopefully your minds won't melt too much from looking at all these numbers. Just like the monopolist, as the quantity, as you want to sell more burritos, you increase the quantity you're going to sell, what you're going to have to do is lower the price. For a price of $10, no one thinks it's worth it, in this example, to buy a burrito. That's just too expensive. They'll buy from competitors. But if they drop the price to $9.50, one person is willing to spend that. And as they keep dropping the price, they drop it down to $7, 6 people are willing to buy it. They drop it down to $4.50, 11 people are willing to buy it. And the lower the price goes, the more people are going to be willing and able to purchase these burritos. Now, the total revenue isn't going to be like perfect competition, where it's just going to increase by the price, or by just increase the entire time as you're selling more and more. Because as you want to sell more, we're selling at a lower price. So it's going to increase versus large increases and smaller, because the price you're selling at is getting smaller and smaller. Until here at, in this case, 10 burritos, you maximize their profit at $50. After that, revenue. After that, the revenue goes down. Again, because we're selling at a lower and lower price. The average revenue, the total revenue divided by the quantity. The total revenue is price times quantity. So the average revenue is just the price. So those two curves are going to be exactly the same. This is going to be exactly the same. Marginal revenue is going to be basically, it's going to be decreasing substantially over time. And just like we saw with the monopolist, there's two things going on. Even though you're selling more, so your revenue should be going up from that, you're selling all the previous units at a lower price. So that's going to make the marginal revenue fall even faster than what we're going to see on the demand curve. And eventually, when we get to the bottom here, so the revenue falls from $50 to $49.50 here at the 11th unit. Our marginal revenue actually turns negative from 50 cents to negative 50 cents. Again, looking at these tables are not a lot of fun, hard to see it intuitively. So here we have, well, This one will show just the two things going on, why we see the marginal revenue fall more than what the price is going to be. So Chipotle, let's look at going from $7.50 to $7, cutting the price by 50 cents here. So as you decrease the price, you're going to move along the demand curve to a greater quantity. So we're going from 5 to 6 burritos. We're going to get $7 for that last burrito. So we're going to increase the revenue by $7 in this case. But, like I said, the previous 5 units, we were selling for $7.50. Now we're only getting $7 back from them. So we're losing some of that revenue. So if we lose 50 cents for those 5 burritos, that ends up being $2.50 less we're making on those burritos. And we're getting $7 from that additional burrito. So our marginal revenue is going to be the $7 that we're getting from that next unit we sell, minus the $2.50 that we lost from all the previous units. So we end up with a marginal revenue of only $4.50 in this case. Yeah, so your textbook calls it the output effect for selling an additional unit and a price effect from like the lower price that you're getting. Not really important to think about how these break down. It's just important to understand why we see this marginal revenue that's going to be lower than our demand curve. So here we have the demand curve and our marginal revenue curve. Just like the monopolist, the marginal revenue curve is below the demand curve. Our demand curve here, marginal revenue curve down here, that even goes negative here at the end. So negative 50 cents for that 11th unit, remember. Yeah. And the reason the marginal revenue curve below the demand curve is because of the price and the output effect. So even though you're selling more, you're getting more money for that next unit you're selling, all the previous units you're making less money on. So that's what takes the marginal revenue curve, shifts it down below the demand curve. And for that last unit, the price effect, so the effect of selling all those previous 10 units at a lower price, is going to outweigh the effect from selling one more unit. That's why we have a negative marginal revenue there. This basic idea, this setup of monopolistically competitive firms makes sense for you guys? Similar to the monopolist, and again, I didn't grade the exam, so I don't know how well you guys felt or understood the monopolist. I want to make sure you guys are getting this, and I'm not just speaking gibberish up here. Or, more than normal. Okay. So, just like a firm in perfect competition, firm in monopolistic competition isn't just going to try to maximize their revenue. Reason they're not going to do that is because, again, we have this marginal cost of increasing production. So we're going to consider marginal cost and marginal revenue. That's what we're going to produce. Just like in perfect competition and just like in monopoly. So the rule, produce where MC equals MR, still going on. So at least that thing isn't changing based on what type of market structure we're in. So a firm will, in a monopolistically competitive market, will maximize their profit where the marginal revenue from the last unit equals the marginal cost. So this is going to occur, like I said, in all these markets. So the table we had earlier with revenue, we can add the cost to it. These are some costs that they basically just made up. For this example, we have our total cost per unit, our total revenue per unit. That's how we're going to get our profit. We also can include the marginal cost and the average total cost. The marginal cost, marginal revenue, is where we're going to determine production. And the average total cost is going to help us see what the profit is at that profit maximizing level of output. Yeah, so in this case, for this hypothetical Chipotle, for the first burrito they sell, the marginal revenue is $9.50. The marginal cost is only $5. From that point, their marginal revenue is greater than their marginal cost. They're going to continue producing. So they move up to 2 burritos per week, drop the price to $9. Their marginal revenue is $8.50, and their marginal cost is $4.50. Again, their marginal revenue greater than their marginal cost. They're gonna say, okay, I can produce another unit. Let's see what happens here. At this third burrito, price at $8.50, the marginal revenue is $7.50, marginal cost is $4. Again, marginal revenue greater than marginal cost. They're gonna continue to produce. When we get to the fifth unit, marginal revenue is $5.50. The marginal cost is $5.50. This is where they're going to stop production. At this point, they maximize their profit. They won't go on and produce another unit. If they try to go to the sixth, their marginal revenue is $4.50, but their marginal cost of production is $6. And their profit drops from $7.50 to $6. They'd be losing money if they produce that. So they choose not to produce that sixth unit, not to sell it. Now, obviously, firms make mistakes. My roommate had on bar rescue last night, and those bars make a ton of mistakes. So sometimes a firm may make a mistake. They may mess up and produce that sixth unit. They'll realize they lowered their profits if they know what they're doing, and they'll reduce production in the future to bring them back up to that profit maximizing level. So we're not saying that firms are always going to be perfect. They're always going to know exactly what to do. There's trial and error involved. Sometimes they're going to make mistakes. But over the long run, they're going to realize that. They're going to adjust production to the appropriate level to maximize their profit. Much easier to look at the curves. And again, this is just like a monopolist. Here at the firm, with the profit maximizing output, the marginal cost curve, so our same kind of like Nike swoosh that we had before, where that crosses the marginal revenue curve. At point A, that's where the profit maximizing quantity is. I'll trace that down here. The x-axis, we have 5 right there. Now they're going to determine pricing by the demand curve, not by the marginal revenue curve. So again, just like a monopolist. We end up with a profit maximizing price at 5 units where it hits the demand curve, so point B here. And so in this case, it's $7.50. The marginal revenue they're getting, the marginal cost of that last unit is $5.50. So it's lower than the profit maximizing price. So they end up charging a higher price. They're able to earn a profit in this example. And that's what we're going to see with these monopolistic competitive firms. Just like monopolies, they're going to be pricing above the marginal cost. And next class, we'll talk about what that means when comparing monopolistic competition with perfect competition. Now, to look at the profit, it's the same thing as we had before. We need to add the average total cost curve, which is more like a U here. So the difference between their price at the profit maximizing level of output, so this point B here, and the point on the average total cost curve at that unit. Times that by the total number of units sold, and that's your profit. That little greenish, yellowish, brownish, this ugly color rectangle in this case. Does this make sense? This the idea of, or I guess not calculating, but looking at the profit based on the graph, the average total cost curve, like it was in both perfect competition and in monopoly. Although the firm's curves are like monopoly. Okay, so the steps to identify what the profit is going to be, to help you think this through for when you have to recreate this for the exam. We're producing here a marginal revenue equals marginal cost. Marginal cost, marginal revenue curve. We cross at point A. The profit maximizing quantity is going to be 5. So you want to think about for the exam, you really just draw a dotted line down here to what the profit maximizing level production is. That line that goes up from the quantity to that point we're producing at, trace that all the way up to the demand curve, the point B. That's going to determine what the price is. You trace the profit maximizing little output all the way up to your demand curve. and see where that hits the y-axis. That's going to be your price. In this case, $7.50. The vertical line is also going to go through the average total cost curve. If the firm is going to be earning a profit, it's going to be down here. It'll go through that curve. So the difference between point B, the price we're selling at for that last unit, and the average total cost curve is going to be your per unit profit. You want to get the total profit, it's that per unit profit times the number of whatever product you're selling, in this case burritos. So that just basically means the area of that little rectangle right there. That's kind of the process you want to go through when drawing this out, recreating this for an exam. Does that make sense for you guys? Okay. So when a firm has this total revenue that's greater than their total cost, they're going to earn an economic profit. Remember, when we're drawing these curves for firms, we're trying to determine the profit, we're looking at economic profit. So we're considering the opportunity costs involved with entering this industry. So this money that the firm uses to produce these goods and services could be used elsewhere. It could be used to operate another line of business. The entrepreneur could have kept that money and, had it invested in the stock market and earned like a nice return. And they could have just taken a job somewhere else earning a modest salary. So this economic profit, this chance to earn money above not just the accounting profit, so you look at their financial statement and they're taking in more money than they're spending, but also earn more money compared to other lines of businesses they could be in. This economic profit gives entrepreneurs a pretty strong incentive to enter this market. So just like in perfect competition, when we see this profit existing, we're going to see new firms enter this market. Or old firms that didn't used to be in the market, now selling a product in that market. So we showed Chipotle making economic profit, the previous example. They could be earning a loss in the short run, but in this case, they were earning a profit. When we see that, and when other firms recognize that, we're going to expect new firms to enter the market. They see a profit opportunity, odds are someone is going to step in and take it. So let's look at what happens. Basically, what's going to happen is that Chipotle, when they face these new competitors, is going to see their demand go down. The reason is because, consumers now have other options. There's other firms for them to go to. If they actually get some consumers, that means those consumers some of them are going to be leaving Chipotle. So here we have our initial supply and demand curves for Chipotle. Or downward sloping demand curve, and we have our marginal revenue curve below that. We're producing the marginal revenue equals marginal cost, that quantity, and we're selling it where that quantity hits the demand curve. So this is our nice big area of profit here. When we have a new competitor enter the market, that will shift Chipotle's demand curve to the left. It'll reduce their demand. Now consumers are going somewhere else. They have another alternative. Also, it's going to make Chipotle's demand curve more elastic. Because there are now more substitutes that didn't exist before, people have more options, they're going to be more sensitive to price. If Chipotle tries to raise their burritos, the price of their burritos, we're going to see more people go to a competitor than we saw before. So because of that, when we shift the demand curve, in this case, it goes from being more steep like this to more flat. I'm not going to make you guys recreate this for an exam. It's really messy, but I want you to understand what's going on in this case. That's what's important for right now. So more firms are going to continue to enter the market until Chipotle's demand curve shifts all the way down to here. So it crosses the average total cost curve at that point where they choose to produce. At this point where the price that they're selling at equals the average total cost, the economic profit in this case is going to be 0, just like we saw in perfect competition. Now the curves look a little bit different, But the point is that the price they're selling at is going to be equal to the average total cost. So there's zero profit times the number of units, still equals zero. This is a different set of curves than we've been looking at before and working with. Do you guys understand this? Are they not too distracting or too confusing for you? I mean, if they are, just tell me. Because I don't want to get too in the weeds in this if I don't have to, because I don't want to confuse you guys needlessly. Because basically what I want you to take away from this, because none of you guys are going to be economists that study this for a living, but you're going to be out there in the real world working for a firm, odds are, in a monopolistically competitive market. So I want you to take away that you're going to have more firms enter the market. People are going to be more sensitive to price for that firm's goods. So in this case, for Chipotle, there's other. Oh yeah, go ahead.
We're not gonna have to draw that, right? We just need to understand what it's saying.
Yeah. So you'll need to obviously recreate the firm, like this one right here.
Yeah.
But I'm not gonna have you shifting all these curves around. That'll be tricky for me to make sure I know exactly what you're doing, and for you guys to memorize. When the whole point of it is just that as new firms enter the market, people become more sensitive to price because there's just more options. Because there's more options and they all have slightly different characteristics, you can find something that meets your needs, slightly better. So consumers in general will be more sensitive to price, so you end up with that flatter demand curve. And that demand curve, the price that we're selling at the profit maximizing quantity, is going to equal the average total cost. So there's zero economic profit in this case. I think it's too messy to expect from a principles class when you're just trying to escape with a basic idea of what's going on. So your textbook has a really nice table of all the different cost curve situations that we see going on in a monopolistically competitive market. Again, you're not gonna have to memorize all these, but it is really good that they include that if you need it or if you think it would help you study. So monopolistically competitive firm could earn a profit or a loss in the short run. So here we have them making a profit, like we saw before. So our most simple example, just where they're going to produce, marginal revenue to marginal cost, trace that quantity up to the demand curve, and there's the price we're selling at. When you add in the average total cost, you can then determine whether they're making a profit or not. So the difference between the price and the average total cost at that level of output is going to be your per unit profit. Which is multiplied by the quantity to your total profit, which we see in this third panel with a little profit rectangle. Here we have a firm making a loss. So we have the same first panel, determining the price we're going to sell at and quantity that we're going to sell. Once we draw the average total cost curve, this time we see it's above the demand curve. So no point does that dip below the demand curve. So this firm is never going to earn a profit with this situation. So the difference between the average total cost curve and the demand curve, that's going to be our loss in this case. So we show that at the profit maximizing level of output, trace it up through the demand curve and up to the average total cost curve. The price is going to be at the demand curve, and up there is going to be where the average total cost curve hits the quantity. Trace that over, that's going to be the price the firm would sell at if they were breaking even. So the difference between those two times the quantity is what the loss is going to be. Now in this market, we're going to see the exact opposite thing happen in this situation. We'll see more firms need to leave the market instead of entering the market. That's going to shift up the demand curve because there's now fewer competitors, and it's also going to turn up because the demand is now less elastic because there's less or fewer options to go to. There's fewer substitutes for Chipotle burritos in this case. And it's going to shift up all the way until the demand curve crosses through the average total cost curve at the profit maximizing level of output. At that point, there's no incentive for firms to leave the market because they can't go and earn a higher economic profit in a different industry, or they would not be better off by going out of business entirely. And firms aren't going to enter the market because, again, there's no chance for economic profit. They're just breaking even. So you wouldn't jump in there and then immediately shift the demand curve down slightly for everyone and then start earning a slight economic loss. So we have no further incentive to leave the market or enter the market once we reach that breaking even. And that's what we see right here. The average total cost curve just barely hits the demand curve, or in math terms is tangent to the demand curve, so the cost of that 1 point and 1 point only, at the profit maximizing level of output. A lot of graphs, a lot of charts and tables that tell you that firms can make a profit. They're going to begin competing until that profit no longer exists. If there is no profit, if firms are earning a loss, some of them are going to leave. And they're going to continue to leave until they reach that break-even point. At that break-even point, if a firm left, they'd be leaving money on the table, so to speak. So our model predicts that firms are going to earn zero profit in the long run. That's what you had to sit here and suffer through me talking for like 30 minutes to get to. But firms don't have to just accept this outcome. It's not like firms in a perfectly competitive market where they really have no choice, or they can't really respond to the market. They basically just react by changing their level of output. Firms can innovate. They can offer new products, or offer products with slightly different characteristics. They can convince consumers that their experience is better. Maybe it isn't, but they can convince them that they're offering something that other firms are not. All right, so they say, your textbook says they can actually make it better, or they can make them perceive it's better. It's kind of a funny way of putting it. I like that. And again, they can also sell at lower cost. Firms in perfect competition don't really have an incentive to do that. I shouldn't say that. I said they don't have the incentive to do that is not as strong as in perfect competition. Obviously, if they lower their costs, they'll earn a higher profit in perfect competition. But for a monopolistically competitive firm, they can earn, these higher profits that they're getting as a result from the demand curve being above the marginal revenue curve, so they're selling at that higher price. They have even more incentive to try to innovate to lower their costs. So the long run isn't like we would see in perfect competition. We're not going to see monopolistically competitive markets always reaching this break-even point in the real world. We're going to see them moving towards this equilibrium point, but every time as they're getting close to that point, we're going to see firms innovate. They're going to try to do something about it. Firms, at least successful ones, don't just sit back, rest on their laurels, think about how good of a job they did, and then don't try to do anything better. They typically try to make better products, to find new consumer needs that they can meet, to advertise to get more consumers looking at their product, convince them that it actually does meet their needs. They're constantly doing things to try to improve their performance. So we're not actually hitting equilibrium all the time, and we're not just staying in equilibrium when we get there. We're constantly pushing it out of equilibrium. Different firms are doing things to improve their product compared to others, knocking it back out of equilibrium, earning them an economic profit, like in this case, and then other firms begin copying them or begin differentiating their products in different ways and end up moving us back in the long run towards equilibrium. So Chipotle is a good example of that. Early on, their strategy for marketing was just, we are more healthy than our competitors. They kind of created fast casual, so they were really competing against other fast food restaurants at the time. Compared to McDonald's or Burger King's, Wendy's, instead of having like deep fried things, or greasy burgers, They had much healthier looking burritos with natural ingredients made right in front of you, so you can see it's high quality. It's not like pink slime. Over time, some reports came out that this really wasn't the case, that it wasn't healthier than their competitors. Of course, the quality of the food going in there, in most cases, is better than places like McDonald's. But the problem is the calories in each meal are super high. It's like your average burrito with like chips and a drink end up being something like 16 or 1700 calories. So pretty close to the daily recommended intake if you're not like an athlete. So not super healthy for people that are eating that much. And then after the textbook, it cites like some New York Times articles that talked about they have like a lot of salt and saturated fat in their meals, I think, compared to like your daily like recommended intake. So not quite as healthy as people thought originally. So you can think of it as they had this profit initially, but it's getting competed away. We're moving towards this equilibrium. As it turns out, they're not as differentiated from their competitors as we initially thought they were. So Chipotle kind of pivoted after this. They had to maintain their edge on their competition. So they tried to appear more socially responsible. So they stopped using GMOs, or announced that they would stop using GMOs. They bought local instead of importing from big farms, certain areas of the country or from overseas. I feel there's one more example, but I'm blanking on it right now. But they generally try to be a more socially responsible company. And again, this is a way that they can differentiate themselves from other fast food restaurants. You don't think of McDonald's as socially responsible. So for people that cared about that, that would differentiate them from other firms. And say, okay, I'm going Chipotle, but it's not destroying the earth as much as these other companies. Now, if you don't care about that, then it's not really going to change your food buying decision. So this is an example of differentiation, focusing on one specific segment of the market. Odds are a firm declaring themselves socially responsible, saying they're taking steps to be socially responsible, isn't going to turn people off. But for people that really care about that really care about that, this will excite them and encourage them to buy more. Okay, this brings us up to monopolistic competition and perfect competition, comparing the two of them. I don't think I can get through all this today. So before we end class, I will just ask you guys your opinion on some of the weird things we can talk about towards the end. We'll do that real quick and then still get out of here a couple minutes early. So I'll talk about Bitcoin quickly, about how it works, how it can be money, and maybe I don't know, why some people think it can't be. I will talk about gypsies because gypsies are just so much fun to talk about, and ordeals because I don't know, it's a Catholic school. But I have some more choices besides that for you guys. So we can do vermin trials. In the Middle Ages, when people's crops were eaten by rodents, they would put those rodents on trial. I mean, in